Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome. We are here to do another live Q&A session hosted by Telgorithm. My name is Samantha Hewitt, and I am a Senior Marketing Manager here at Telgorithm, and I'm here to moderate today's session. We are live, but don't worry, your mics and cameras are turned off, so nothing to worry about there. You can submit your own questions, and we really encourage that you do. Please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom window, or you can just send us directly in the chat. The more information you can include in your questions, such as your company messaging use case or whatever would kind of help us interpret the question, the better Aaron will be able to answer that question and give you value. If we don't answer your question, if we're unable to, we're not at time, still send them in. We will log them all and we'll be reaching out to you directly. So no worries there. But without further ado, as you know, here to lead this conversation and guide us through the questions around A2P 10DLC is industry leader and Telgorithm CEO and co-founder, Aaron Alter. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you, Samantha, and appreciate everyone attending. For prior attendees who are attending again, and for anyone that's made time out of their busy day that's attending for the first time. Lots of important things to talk about today and educate folks about, and excited to always do that. And I'll also say thanks for putting in the work to set these up. It's greatly appreciated, Samantha.
Thanks, Aaron. Really appreciate that. And yeah, welcome back to those of you who have joined us before. We're happy to see you again. And it's really great to see some new faces. So thank you for coming. So we're going to be brief because we have a lot to talk about as always. So when we look at our agenda today, it's light. We want to start out by just addressing some of the latest happenings right now in A2P 10DLC. We want to discuss how to be successful with A2P 10DLC post-registration. That's generally the theme of this webinar or Q&A, but because a lot of people are still in the throes of registration, we want to make sure we're hitting on what's actually going on, and then we'll dive into Q&A. But don't hold back, ask any questions you have as we go, and we will address them as we receive. Okay, so the first slide here, the latest in A2P 10DLC, we have bulleted out some of the hottest happenings, I guess you might say, in the industry, things that are going on. Aaron's going to take the stage, and feel free to just hit them wherever you want to.
For sure. So here's the way I'll start this. I mean, we've done these Q&As for quite a while already and done quite a few webinars. I think back till, we'll say, mid to late last year, we were talking about this thing called registration or a 10DLC. And even then, even though it's already been quite a while since this concept has been rolled out, particularly in Verizon Wireless, they were the first to launch their A2P path all the way back in the beginning of 2020. We're in June of 2023 now. So maybe, unfortunately, folks in the industry were not aware of it, and there were different levers that were pushed that I've talked about previously. But what I'll say today at a high level is I think at this point, I would assume it's safe to say most folks are aware of the concept called A2P 10DLC today. And we're going to assume that everyone understands why they need to register. I'll mention briefly. So the first bullet here, it talks about, and what I've talked about in the past are 3 different levers when this A2P path or this high throughput or business to consumer messaging path were released by the different network operators. It was not done for fun or for voluntary reasons. And so by default, if you weren't on it, you were on the old path of person to person or P2P. And so they had to incentivize businesses to actually move over. And they primarily used 3 different levers. One was hiring carrier pass-through fees. So if you were sending a text message from a phone number that's not associated with a registered branding campaign, you would pay a higher fee per message. And they started doing that again very early on. The other lever they were using was heavier filtering. As many are aware, the old unsanctioned path, it was kind of like the Wild West, and many messages that were legitimate, that were fully compliant, were just not getting through because of this whole war that happened between essentially the messaging providers and the mobile network operators. And that filtering has gotten even tighter, and tighter, which leads to the third level, which will be ultimately complete blockages, which I'll get to in a second. So with regards to the lever of higher pass-through fees, I'm sure everyone here joining today, I would assume, is aware from your provider that those fees are going to be increased excessively, or not going to be. Today, June 1st, have just increased, many cases, to a penny or more per text message, which if you ask me is insane. I mean, many folks always talk about, oh, can you give me this price on a per message or 00 this? I mean, if you're not registered, that whole talk is out the window. And so point number one is the fees have increased beginning today, even further up to a penny. I believe Verizon put out a bulletin yesterday where they're going to be increasing their fees also penny plus by July 1st. But more importantly here, it's not about unregistered fees. And the reason is because the industry, meaning the aggregators, and these are the companies that have integrations directly with the network operators, that's your AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, are basically have announced shutdowns. So it's not even about, oh, can I not register yet? And I don't even mind paying these fees anymore. The bottom line is they've all at this point decided that over the next couple of months, if you're not registered, it doesn't matter who your provider is, there is no unregistered traffic. You're just going to be completely cut off. Many have done it already, but the final ones have now announced it. Literally the biggest provider, by no means the only provider. I'll mention their name. I don't like to mention names in general, but just for the sake here, because it's pretty obvious, Twilio, largest player in this field, has announced, and you could see that posted on their website, a July 5th partial cutover followed by a complete cutoff of August 31st. That means that, again, any messages that are attempt to be sent beyond August 31st, and likely a big portion of that by July 5th, that's just a month away from now, will forget about a higher pass-through fee, forget about filtering. Your messaging will be disrupted. And the point here is, it's no longer about if I should register. It should be, the conversation should be about how do I register? What is the right process to register? Not only what is the right process, once I do register, what are the things I should be aware of in this new ecosystem, this new environment? Is there anything that works differently in this new environment that worked differently in the old Wild West or the person-to-person environment? And the answer is yes. And we'll talk about those things today. But again, the main point here is at this point, if you want to continue sending messages over local phone numbers in North America, and it's going to be expanding, you need to register. There's no ifs, ands, and buts. There's no higher pass-through fees or filtering. You need to have a process for that. And if you don't, you need to get one in place ASAP, because no matter your provider, whether it's Twilio or not, check with them. Your traffic will be cut off by the end of this summer, period. And I could tell you that for a fact, and you can validate that all across wherever you need to validate that. So that being said here, this is not more of a scare situation. It's more of, this is something that's been available. It's been out there for a while. And it's more of basically the finalizing the shift of this ecosystem by the network operators and saying, this is it. We've given it time. We've given a couple of years now for folks to go about this process. That's it. We're shutting the spigot off. And here's the last chance. You got to get going or not. Let's move forward all together within this new ecosystem. And let's have a conversation about the ecosystem and this new ecosystem and how it works and how it could work, how we can make it even better, but how it even works today to make your ultimately business successful. One other point I'll bring up here is on branding campaign rejections. So there's two parts to this coin. So and we'll get to in a second, timelines. That's a separate thing we'll discuss. But many folks might have noticed if you've been through a process of trying to get campaigns approved by your provider or through your provider, you might have noticed certain things that might have gone through in the past now are being rejected. And there's reason for that. Obviously, there's more crackdown happening to make sure that this ecosystem, now that there's a rush of everyone trying to register, remains clean. I wouldn't say that there are any new rules that are being put in place. It's more of just certain things being enforced a little bit further, just to touch briefly on some of those items. So for instance, back in the day, we'll say back in the day, but 2 years ago, you didn't necessarily have to put a website under the brand when you were creating a brand. Now you do. The assumption is if you have a legitimate business in the year 2023, you should have a website. And if you don't, there's obviously some flags there if you don't. So you should, sorry about that, you should have a website there, and that is now required. But in addition to that, there are some new sections under the campaign section that you might have noticed. And a lot of the common rejections are from that. And that is this thing called the CTA section. There's a call to action section when you create a campaign in the registry. And what that specific field is really important. And what that's supposed to tell the aggregator is how are your customers or your end users, the ultimate end users receiving the message, where are they actually going to opt in? Now, many times that can be done verbally. Sometimes many times it's done on a website, but that's the important point. Many times, and it's whatever reason, that if you have an opt-in, meaning a place on your website for someone to enter a phone number in a form, the assumption by default is going to be that that reason that phone number is being collected is so that you could that at some point there's possibility that this number will be used to text message. And if they don't find opt-in language, clear opt-in language under that form, meaning the DCA that's reviewing these campaigns, they will reject a campaign, even if in the call to action section, you specifically delineate and say, explicitly, yes, I have a form on my website, but we don't get opt-ins from our customers, except either maybe by an appointment or over a phone call. My point here is, even if you delineate that and say explicitly, we're not getting opt-in from the website, but there is a website that they will check under the brand, and there's a place to enter numbers on that website, and there's no opt-in, your campaign will get rejected unless you remove that form or make it at least at minimum that the phone number section is optional, or you actually, better yet, add actual opt-in language to that site. So that's one of the things I'll just mention of late that's come up recently that that they're really going heavy on right now. Some folks, you might have experienced that. If you haven't, please make sure that that's something that's you're taking thought into when you're creating these campaigns. One, again, and also another one is making sure the URL works. They go to the website and the URL doesn't work, or they go to the website and it says, this is not a secure URL. Those are all things that you get campaign rejections for. No one wants rejection because there's delay. There's also potential additional added vetting fees for that. So again, with all the rush of everyone trying to register, along with some of these things are coming to light, and a little bit making sure the DCA is making sure that all the traffic as there's this rush is clean. These are some of the things that we've seen of late, and some things that you should be aware of and make sure as you're creating your campaign. I'll just mention a final note here. When you're putting your sample messages, make sure that the brand's name is in the sample message itself, and that you have opt-out language in the message itself. A common question we get is, well, some of our use cases are conversational messaging. How am I going to put an opt-out in every message? It doesn't work. And while that's true, and that's not, you don't necessarily have to put an opt-out in every conversational message per se, but they're still going to expect to see that in your samples when they review the campaign itself. So if that is a very common rejection where sample messages are missing opt-out language in the when that's set up, that is a big flag for why a campaign will get rejected. So again, two top things: make sure your website, if there's a place to submit numbers, has clear opt-in, otherwise remove it or make it optional. Make sure that your call to action section clearly specifies exactly how you obtain opt-ins for your customer. I would say those are the biggest things to watch out for in regards to preventing rejections today.
Perfect. I think that's really helpful. It's tactical stuff that we can also support anyone with if you need additional help or resources.
Of
The reason why
course.
you're bringing this up, Aaron, is because yes, manual campaign vetting is taking an immensely long amount of time for a lot of people. But if you don't even get your brand approved to begin with, and then your campaign, you will just delay yourself even longer. So it's very important. And a lot of people now that are going through registration are facing these issues. And that's why we're bringing it up now. So clearly they're on the rise because more people are trying to get it done. But I do
That's
have some questions for you, specifically around the shutdown. I'm going to start with this one that refers to starter brands, so we know that they are coming from Twilio. So the question is, do we have to delete starter brands and campaigns? Are starter brands nullified? Can you speak on that when it comes to starter brands and maybe what that is and how these are being shifted over?
So if you look in the campaign registry, and what we're a big fan of, and you could view our previous Q&As and webinars that we've done, we're closely connected with the registry itself and your leadership. Matter of fact, we hosted the vice president of the campaign registry last year to ask many of these questions. But if you go to campaignregistry.com, they are the reputation authority that the network operators have chosen as they rolled out their A2P path. And they are the only source of truth. So if you want to know the actual truth, because there's unfortunately a lot of misinformation out there, it's someplace we highly recommend you go to regardless, but in campaignregistry.com. And if you'll notice, there's collateral on that website that talks about different use cases, campaign types. You'll notice there is no words that say anywhere starter brand. There is no such concept. That concept, unfortunately, was created by, I'm not going to mention names. I mentioned one name today, but I don't like to mention names because in general, this is more than one, it's about more than one provider. There is no concept of a starter brand. Early on, as many may be aware today, when you create a brand, part of the minimum requirement to create a brand is you supply a tax ID, an EIN number for that business, and its legal name. That is the minimum requirement to register a brand. Some providers, messaging providers early on, decided, it's difficult for customers to get the EINs from their customers. And I mentioned in the past, no doubt, it could be a difficult, and it's a process to do that for sure. So what did they do? They started to look at different entity types within the registry, and the registry early on created an entity type called sole proprietor. Sole proprietor is not a established business. Sole proprietor is someone that just started a business, maybe a website selling apparel. They haven't registered yet for taxing reasons. And therefore the campaign registry recognized this, and they created this thing called sole proprietor, which much lower volumes to support this use case. What ended up happening is some big providers created this thing called a starter brand and said, oh, even regular businesses that have registered with the IRS, that are paying taxes, come here, don't worry about your EIN numbers, bring them all in here. We created this thing called a starter brand, as long as your volumes are somewhat low. And that was never intended for that. And what ended up happening is the network operators got wind of this fairly quickly and said, this is not the right setup for this. And what they said is they put timelines on this. I believe one of them was April 20th. One vendor got an injunction to the end of June, right now, actually, to basically say that you have to get, if you're a legitimate brand, you have to, and this is important, if you're a legitimate brand, you have to register properly as a regular brand, not as a sole proprietor, a regular normal brand. You could use a low volume campaign, which gives you lower throughputs. And if you are actually a sole proprietor, they sunset sole proprietor 1.0, and you have to register as sole proprietor 2.0, which now requires a manual approval to get even approved by that, and requires certain reportings that you have to do monthly. So the only one that can remain on that old path is no one, because essentially, as of today, even with that other provider, sole proprietor or starter brand no longer exists. So that means you would have experienced a disruption by now if you were on that. But that's essentially what that whole concept and idea was about then. There technically could be something called a concept of a starter brand in a real way, where you take a low volume campaign concept and make a starter brand out of that and call it that. But that's not, even if you were to set that up, which you could do, that's not a way of saying, oh, I want to take a shortcut here and it'll allow me not to get an EIN number. That is required across the board, unless you get a special manual approval now that you are verified as a SP and there's certain reporting involved. Be short of that, you have to get EINs, and that is part of the process for registering as a normal brand today. So just to discuss what the starter brand situation and history was.
Perfect. It looks like the person who asked has clarified, with all that information, do they have to delete their starter brand? Does it need to be deleted?
That would be a question for the provider that's provided the starter brand. So I can't answer that, but what I could say is if your numbers are associated with that, your message will be disrupted if it hasn't been already. So
Okay.
I'm not saying sure that you necessarily have to delete it. That would be, again, this is something that was created. It's not a concept in the campaign registry. So it's a concept that they created that has some allocation on the registry side. So that would be a question for the provider that did that. But more importantly, I could tell you for a fact that regardless of whether that's deleted or not, you need to take the number that were, or numbers that were associated there and put them on the legit brand for sure. Good
Perfect.
question.
Okay. Hopefully that answers the question. We do have solutions for Sole Proprietor 2.0. We can get into
Mhm.
those. So maybe hit up our Q&A or our chat and let us
Yes.
know if that's something you want to talk about. Otherwise, we'll hold on that for right now. We do have
Mhm.
another question about how many campaigns can be under one brand? I'm not sure if that's something easy to answer, but how many campaigns can be under one brand is the beginning of
Mhm.
the question. And then what will happen on August 31st? Is there a total shutdown cutoff if no brand and no campaign are created? I think that you have kind of answered that already, but maybe you can just
Yeah.
start with the first part.
Sure. So there's two, that's exactly, those are two different questions. Let's break them
Yeah.
apart. How many brands, how many campaigns can you put under a single brand? So this has fluctuated. It was initially when the campaign registry was first launched, it was a really high number. They didn't really even put a cap on it. Then at some point they put a cap of 5,000 on it. Now, as of late, I believe as of 3 weeks ago, the cap is currently for 1,000. So when I say a cap, that means by default. So you can always go to the campaign registry and say, obviously, I have a use case for X, Y, and Z, and I need to do X, Y, and Z, and you can get an exception. But by default, you need. So 1 second, let me clarify here. We're asking how many campaigns could be under a brand, or how many brands under a CSP? Campaigns under a brand, right? Is that the question? Campaigns under a brand?
Correct.
Campaigns under a brand, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is in the 50 area. But again, by default, but you can get an exception to that. If you have a use case to go beyond that, you can get an exception and go beyond that. Let me just explain the reasoning there, because the hierarchy is brand. Brand is one of your customer. Campaign should be delineated by use case within that specific customer. So there shouldn't be a concept. A lot of time where this question comes up is more of, I want to take a bunch of I have 1,000 customers. I want to save some money or condense this system. So I'm just going to take all of my customers, put them under this one brand, and each of my customers will represent the campaign. That is usually where this question comes up and why folks bring up this question. And I could tell you that that is a big mistake to do that for a whole number of reasons. Number one is if each of your customers is a campaign and trying to get away with, for instance, not giving a tax ID because you don't need a tax ID at the campaign level. But in T-Mobile's case, as an example, this is about throughputs, all brands share a daily limit. So all campaigns under a brand share a daily limit on T-Mobile. So if the brand is given, I'm just going to make up an arbitrary number, 2,000 messages a day for the brand. You can create 50 campaigns. Doesn't matter how many campaigns you choose. Every single one of those campaigns are sharing the daily limit on T-Mobile. That's point number one. That means if anybody exceeds that or anybody gets to that level, you're shut. There's no other messages going out for the rest of your customer base. Number two, and even more importantly, if someone sends a wrong message, like let's just say someone's not compliant or an opt-out rate goes up, or even a mistake happens, you can get a concept of a campaign or a brand getting suspended. Last thing you want is a brand getting suspended because it wasn't set up correctly and they detect that this is multiple businesses instead of multiple use cases, and you have a complete shutdown. So the way we always recommend strongly, because we've seen this happen, don't take the shortcut. There's a low volume campaign where you could get started off small and then grow with your customer base there. So to answer this question, and again, I don't know where it was seeded or rooted in. I believe the default is 50 under a brand. You can get that hard if you have a legitimate use case to add more than that many amount of use cases. I mean, if I think under a given brand, how many use cases one single business would have, I mean, there's only a certain limited amount there. So I would want to hear that. Speak to us. I'm speaking in generalities here.
Yeah.
You have a legitimate need and there's a reasoning there. We are, as I mentioned, we're close with the DCAs, we're close with the network operators in the registry, and we will walk that path for you. If it's legitimate, we can absolutely get it potentially hard or work you on a path to get it hard for. But again, I just want to make sure it's not seated in potentially trying to take a shortcut where you're basically just one EIN number under our name, and then every campaign is a business. That is not the right hierarchy, and you're leading yourself and your customers down a very a rabbit hole that's not too pretty. I will tell you that.
Perfect. I think that was good, Aaron. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we can go ahead.
Actually, one
Unless,
more thing to add there, because I confused it up front. So
sure.
for if you're a CSP, so that's the level above the brand, right? CSPs by default can have 1,000 brands under them. And if you hit 1,000, you could then email the campaign registry and they could lift that limit for you. That I just want to clarify that because I mixed the two up front. So again, if you're a CSP, the amount of brands you can create technically can go unlimited, but they start you off with 1,000. And then if you need to go beyond it, you can just ask them for an approval, and that's pretty fast, and they can get you beyond that.
Perfect. Okay. So in terms of campaign vetting approval times, I think it's about time for us to move on, but do you want to make any notes about what's going on there or how Telgorithm is helping solve for this extremely?
Totally. So speaking of approval times, I always talk about right, to solve a problem, what's the root of the problem? So the root of the problem here is that even though there are many messaging providers, there are a limited amount of what's called DCAs, and that means direct connect aggregators. These are the companies that send the message that have binds built directly with T-Mobile or Verizon. Your run-of-your-mill provider that you would imagine is not a DCA. I'll just put out, I don't like mentioning competitors' names. It's not the way we do things here, but I'm just gonna, for educational purposes, I'll just mention just a few names. So let's just say we say Telnix, a SignalWire, a Plevo, and a Twilio, and a Bandwidth, right? We'll just say those are, and Vonage. Those are famous cloud communication messaging providers. Those providers, none of those providers I mentioned are DCAs. So that means that when you send an API call to them, they do have no relationship or technical interconnect relationship to send the message directly into T-Mobile's network. They use a middleman called a DCA, a direct connect aggregator that does have that bind built. They send an API call, or if they're using SMPP, which is the raw protocol, they're sending information to them, and then that's then being sent to the network operator. And so you have a ton of, imagine this, you have different layers to the ecosystem. You have the network operators, we'll say, on the other side, and then on top, on the sender side, you have the DCA, and then you have the cloud messaging provider. Many times it goes deeper. Many people white label and relabel, and relabel. You can go like 7 levels deep, one API all the way back up, all the way there. So it's important to know where your provider stands in that ecosystem. But the point that I want to get out here is that last year, there were some advantages that were taken by customers of a certain provider, or we'll say certain providers, that allowed cannabis content to come through on A2P 10DLC. And that primarily was going through one of the DCAs ultimately. And T-Mobile got wind of this last summer, exactly a year ago, and isolated it to one specific DCA, which so happens to be many of the providers use that exact same DCA. And so therefore T-Mobile told them what had now been automated, right? They had an automated process where they would get the campaign information and it would just shoot it into T-Mobile's registry platform known as SDG. And what was prior automated and much faster, now they took that automation advantage away, and they now require this particular DCA to manually, that means a person has to manually look at every single campaign and hit a check button, confirm that a person looked at it, and then they could send it for final rest at T-Mobile's platform. And obviously a manual process has delay, and things started to get delayed last summer. But then with the announcements that have come out beginning this year by many, and they're all using the same DCA, you could see this bottleneck, getting really filled up very fast. And that's what's happening here. And to be honest, 4 weeks, I'm hearing in some places right now, is actually pretty fast. We're hearing day after day of people that are waiting, that have pending campaigns with no issues, fully compliant, fully everything was checked through, all the check boxes checked off, that are waiting on approval since March. So we're now in June. We have people that are waiting for campaign approvals dating back to March that we spoke to as recently as last week. And it's because there is this backup, and now with these cutoffs, and I didn't answer the question before, second part of the question, by the way, just remembered, with regard to these straight cutoffs, that is now going to get even worse before it gets better. So you're talking minimum 4 weeks and 8 weeks. And speaking of which, the cutover, I don't recall the exact nature of the question, but just to repeat here, cut over means just that, cut off. That means that if a message is sent from from a number that is not associated with a registered, fully DCA approved campaign ID beyond August 31st, and that provider, others it's already in place in some places, but in that provider I mentioned earlier, does not higher pass-through fees, there's not heavier filtering, that message will drop. It's not going to get through, it's going to be blocked. And by the way, that vendor will charge you for that message, including carrier pass-through fees. So that's the worst of the worst. So yes, that is a hard date. And as a matter of fact, if you go to that vendor site, look up their Q&A, there's a question there that even asks there, will this date be postponed? And you should read the answer there. They're very clear that this date, this is the final set, because as I mentioned, registration didn't just come out a month ago. It came out a long time ago, and it would been the job of providers to provide this information to get their customers to register. And now we're in the final stages. And so it's unfortunate, many companies have been left in the dark and not provided right information, and we feel for them. And by the way, I'll mention a lot of what Telgorithm does is we educate, and we've been educating for 2+ years now on this subject. Many times to deaf ears until somebody runs into an issue, but we've created relationships and technologies that streamline this process. The average campaign approval time with Telgorithm, full DCA approval, takes approximately now 5 to 7 business days. And while that's still long and will go shorter, it's much better than in other places. And the reason for that is we've built a very tight tech, which we'll talk about in a second. And we've built a close relationship. We know our customers, we validate who they are, that things are legitimate. And that allows us to do what I call TSA pre-screen. They know this is coming from Telgorithm. They know what tech Telgorithm has. They know where we stand in the ecosystem. They know that we vet our customers in a proper way. And therefore they give us a trust where they approve our campaigns at a much faster rate than in general. And so that's one area that I could say we could help, and we've streamlined the entire process, and we have hooks that inform you in real time. We also have abilities to allow you temporarily to send traffic unregistered. It is unregistered while you're registering. I don't know how long we'll be able to do that, not because of us, but because the system is being shut in general from a technical perspective. But as I speak to you today, we have the ability to allow that in situations where you're waiting, are 5 to 7 days. And by the way, some might think, well, they're just saying that. How do I know that? We actually have a way, and we have information out there. You could check us out. You can reach out to our team, where without signing a single thing from Telgorithm, you could actually share a campaign with us. No Telgorithm contract. You share a campaign with us, and you will be able to see on your end through the registry how long it takes for us to get a DCA approval. So you could actually try it out risk-free with no commitment, no nothing to Telgorithm, to see if what we are saying is actually correct. You could actually make us put our money where our mouth is, which we're big fans of. We've always wanted that, and that's what we try to provide in general. So that's what I'll say on that side. It's going to get worse. One other point I'll actually mention with that provider, so think about it. Imagine you have a cutoff of August 31st. Today is June 1st. The average campaign in good times in general is 4+ weeks. And you have a partial cutoff, a half cutover on July 5th. That means if you haven't submitted your campaigns today, you're in real deep trouble right now with that provider. Real deep trouble, because those timelines are going to get worse because everyone is rushing in. And if it's 4+ weeks now, I mean, you're essentially out of time. I hate to be the bearer of bad news for anyone realizing this today. That being said, we would love to help. We could definitely help expedite that for you. And we'd love to talk to anybody that's interested in that. And of course, we put our money where our mouth is, and we give you opportunities and ways to validate that. But just something anyone here that is using that vendor to be aware of it. I'm going to be cut off pretty soon, and approval times are pretty short. I might even be too late right now. So something to definitely think about and not postpone at this point.
Awesome. We're going to run a quick poll to ask you guys how long you are currently waiting for campaign approvals if you are in the process. We're going to get that started. It'll pop up on your screen. Go ahead and answer that for us if you don't mind, just so we can kind of get an idea of where you're at. And if a week or less with Telgorithm is appealing, I think that for many people it is. So we'll give you just a minute to answer this if you don't mind. While you're doing that, we're going to move on to our next slide, because we're talking about what's going on in the industry. We're doing our education piece, but now we want to talk about what actually happens after you register. How do you actually choose the best provider long term?
Yes, and this is one of our favorite subjects. Let me know when we can begin on that one.
Let's begin.
Oh, cool. For sure. So as I mentioned earlier, right, there's this concept of registering. Everyone's now focused. I'm going to be cut off. I need to register. How do I register? What's the process? How do I streamline this? Everyone's focused on that. But what unfortunately many are not focused on is what happens after I'm done. Imagine this. Imagine you took someone who's waiting from March. Let's assume your customer is paying all this money for a brand and then a campaign and then maybe a vetting on top of that. And you're waiting all this time to get an approval. You get approved, start sending messages, and all of a sudden a day later, boom, message is blocked. Why? Everything's compliant. My opt-out rates are great. I'm getting opt-in from every customer. I have opt-out languages in all my messages. I have opt-ins on my website. Customers want to receive the message. Everything, all the content is fully compliant. I spent all this money. Why are my messages not getting through? And this is something that is being missed right now with all this rush. And it's something I want to paint a picture about to make very clear. And this is very, very important. So when you register, what is it you're actually registering for? And there's a big misconception that you're registering for this thing called compliance. And that's actually not true. I'll prove it to you, because what's the difference between P2P or person-to-person protocol, person-to-person protocol versus A2P or application-to-person? What's this A2P or business-to-consumer messaging? Thanks for responding, everyone. What's the purpose of A2P? Why couldn't they make registration on this person-to-person current protocol? Just everyone needs to register. We know who you are, and we're now going to make a clean ecosystem on person-to-person. What is this A2P? So the point here, that's exactly the point. You are registering to get availability, to get access to A2P messaging. Now, what is A2P messaging? That is the concept and idea of a business needs to communicate with its customers. So while I could, have a conversation with you, Samantha, with our phones, person to person, 60 messages in a minute is more than enough per number. But if I'm a business and maybe, I'm a utility company and I have millions of users and there's an outage, 60 messages in a minute ain't gonna work. If I'm running some big Black Friday sale, 60 messages in a minute per number is not going to work. And so the network operators realized this over time with the advent of technology, because text messages were created back in the early 90s where there was no cloud communication like we have it today. There wasn't this concept of communicating in this fashion. And so they recognized this, but they realized that the current and only protocol was never intended for high throughput business to consumer communication. And therefore that set them on the path of creating A2P, which is meant to do one thing, give businesses a much higher throughputs where needed to properly communicate with their customers. But to do that, they wanted to keep the ecosystem clean. And so they set up this registration process to make sure that that new ecosystem would be clean as it rolled it out. But fundamentally, what this is about is throughputs, right? Low volume mixed campaign versus a dedicated campaign, external added vetting through a partner. What does that get you? It's all differences in risk score to get you higher throughputs. So if it's all about throughput, fundamentally, A2P, literally by delineation, is about throughput. Well, there's a very basic question to ask here. I've registered. Am I getting what I registered and paid for? Well, what do I mean by this? So let's take an example. So it's about throughput. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, someone asked a question about, how many campaigns can I put under a brand? And I was talking about throughput. So every single network operator has taken a different approach when it comes to throughput on A2P 10DLC. So as an example, T-Mobile, I mentioned before, gives a daily limit at the brand level. So one of your customers is a brand, and they give a daily limit. I believe the lowest limit they have is 2,000 messages in a day. Now, AT&T is a whole separate count. They do it at a campaign per number. So let's talk about that for a second. So imagine I'm using a provider today. I go through this whole process, I register, and then, I have 5 campaigns under this brand, and I start sending out messages thinking everything is good. And I reached 2001 messages in a day period. For many businesses, that is nothing. That could happen in less than a minute for many businesses. But even if not, even if it's a growing business that's not there yet, what happens when I hit 2001 messages? Well, I will tell you what happens. That message will drop. It will instantly fail because T-Mobile is actively monitoring that, actively. And so if you send 2001 messages from a campaign that's approved for only 2,000 messages daily, that message will drop. Your customer is going to have a disruption. They're going to get upset about that because they went through this whole process, gave tax IDs and did this whole stuff, and they're compliant. What's going on? They're going to get a drop message. You're going to be charged for this message, including carrier pass-through fees. So this is not a right way to do things. So that being said, someone needs to manage this, right? AT&T is per campaign level. Verizon is per number level, and each network operator does this differently. So you need someone in this ecosystem to fundamentally support your approval on A2P 10DLC has to be managing this for you. Because if it's not, you are 100% going to very fast run into this problem and not even have a clue what's going on. And what we found is early on, understanding this concept fundamentally is for the most part, the ecosystem, most messaging providers today are not even there. They're just get yourself registered, hack through a Band-Aid to get you registered, and not even talking about this. And I can tell you that you could validate this on your provider's websites. Simply look up, for instance, Google error 323, error 9813. I won't mention the names, but look at every provider, look at your provider today and Google your provider and write exceeding T-Mobile limit. What happens? And they're going to put an error there. So the fact that they have an error there means that they're not managing it for you, because if they were, how would you ever exceed your limit? They're managing it for you. And so that's the point. You're being forced to pay all this money, go through this whole process, and no one is even managing this for you, setting you up for disruption and liability. And by the way, you have to pay for that on top of that. And so the question is what would you need to support this, to properly have yourself managed in a way where you could fully take advantages of throughputs and not worry about this situation? And the right way is, and we talk about a daily limit from T-Mobile, right? So a daily limit. Well, when does this day start? That would be, for starters, when would that be? That would be important to know that. Is it a rolling 24-hour period? Is it midnight to midnight? If it's a midnight to midnight, does it include daylight savings time? Which time zone is it in? Metro PCS, sure many know, is a subsidiary of T-Mobile. Well, is a message to them included in that 2,000 message limit? Again, all these things are very important for someone to know the answers to and for someone to track, or you are going to have disruption after you went through this entire process. And what I will say is that if you're going to find a provider to support you on A2P 10DLC, you need to make sure that your provider is going to provide that for you, or you're going to build it yourself. And that would be very hard to do and maintain. I could tell you that because we built it. We took a lot of time and effort proactively, and we know all the players in the ecosystem, the registrar, the network operators, and we built a bunch of logics around that and did all the research to protect our customers in this area. And that is not a nicety. That is something that is fundamental to your success on A2P 10DLC, not a nicety. I know we call it a smart queuing, but it does that setup, and I'll explain how it works in a second, but that's not a nicety. That is mission critical. If you or your provider is not doing that, you will run into disruption 100%. At some point, if not very quickly, you're going to run into it if that's not being managed and tracked. At Telgorithm, we've built those logics early on where we manage and track that for you. So for instance, in T-Mobile's case, we know that it's midnight Pacific time, including daylight savings time, that they reset their calculator. At the brand level, what we do is we queue up your messages. So we calculate how many messages were sent under that brand. And if you reach the total limit, we send you real-time alerts letting you know when you're 50% there, 75% there. And then if you make it 100%, we send that. If you ever make it to 100%, we don't even drop your message. We queue the message for you and wait till the time T-Mobile's timer resets and then send the message. Not only that, we've even recently added 2 features that midnight Pacific time may not be the best time to send the message that gets queued. So we added time routing built in so that you could say, hey, if it gets queued at midnight Pacific time, hey, Telgorithm, wait till 9 a.m. to send it. We even built message expiry. That means you could rescind the message completely. Oh, it didn't send by this time. It's no longer necessary. It doesn't make sense to send this anymore. Just rescind the message completely. And these are protections that are unique that Telgorithm has built. There is no DCA. Those are the aggregators, and there's no messaging. We wish more would that has built that mechanism, that machinery today. We are the only ones where we wish more would, because it's fundamental, that protects our customers, and not only from T-Mobile, from AT&T, Verizon, and all the other providers. We are in close touch with the ecosystem, as I mentioned, and we're constantly tweaking, we're updating. When you elect us as a connectivity partner, the campaign registry directly sends us the approval. We know exactly what it is. We know when any changes are happening, and take care and handle that for you. But again, I will repeat, I cannot stress this enough. This is something that should be top of mind for everyone. I know everyone's focused on registering, but what are you registering for? And are you going to be successful beyond that? And those are things that should be top of mind for everyone here.
Absolutely. I think it's also worth calling out that these product features that have been built are included in our product. We do not charge extra
That
for
is correct.
these features that are not found anywhere else in the industry.
That's right, because it's fundamental. Because we believe it's not an add-on. It's fun.
Right.
It's like giving a car without an engine, or a car without a battery, or a car without, without gas. It's not gas is not an add, even though you do get charged, but it's not. We consider it a core part of it, part of the product, for you to be fundamentally successful, and therefore that is included in our core costs, which are aggressive, by the way. In general, we try to make things doable across the board. Message deliverability costs, we try to think of everything here, but that's 100% right. And that's the reason we structured it that way.
We want messaging to work how messaging should work.
That's right.
So we actually have a question going back to campaign vetting, if you don't mind. The question is
Sure.
that if campaigns are still in progress after August 31st, will they still be cut off, even if you've already started the
Yes,
process?
that's right. They will. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but yes, that's why if you go to that vendor's website or anybody, it will clearly delineate. That's why they're saying everything needs to be submitted ASAP. So yes, you need to submit as soon as possible. We'd love to help you here at Telgorithm. Try us out. We'd love to and help you get through that. But the answer is, if any number that's not associated with a campaign that is fully DCA approved. By the way, I want to actually add something. In the registry, and many providers have different statuses. There's a registered status, there's an active status, there's a verified status, there's a vetted status, there's an external vetted status. None of those statuses, while they're all required to get to the final finish line, the final one that's needed is something called DCA approval. In the registry, if you have a CSP account, there's a column all the way to the right side in the campaign. It's called DCA approval. It should be yes, marked as yes. If any number sends a message after August 31st that is not associated with a campaign that is DCA yes, that message will be cut off. It won't be blocked, and you will be charged for that message, including a carrier pass-through fee, by August 31st, to be clear. Yes, and thank you for asking that.
And with Telgorithm's expedited campaign vetting approval, we basically can support customers in avoiding that issue completely. We can get this done
That is
completely.
correct.
If
We
you
will get
start,
yes.
go
You
ahead, I'm
need to
sorry.
start right away. You need to
Yeah,
start right away. Don't wait.
don't wait and
Waiting
come
is
to
over.
us.
We love to
Okay.
help.
Okay, and then an add-on to this question. So if the campaigns are currently pending, can they switch over to Telgorithim? Do they take their campaigns off of pending from that connectivity provider and onto us, or how does that work?
Yeah, so this goes into a different subject. I don't know that we have so much time for it today.
Okay.
And that is, you should check out our social media for it, where we elaborate and talk about the following subject. I actually talked about this subject with the vice president of the campaign registry. Again, you can find that in our social media. And that is, what is the difference between a CSP and a reseller in regards to the registry? I will just say some brief thoughts on that. If your provider today is referring to you as what's called an ISV, you are a CSP. You are not a reseller. And what I mean by this is many providers earlier was like, give us all the tax IDs, give us all your customer information, go into our trust hub or this hub and use this and that. And you funneled in all this stuff. Reseller in the ecosystem, and you can validate yourself on campaignregistry.com, is nothing. It bears no meaning. What bears meaning and what brands become associated with are the CSP ID, the Campaign Service Provider ID. If you go to campaignregistry.com and hit the word register, it will clearly, the very first thing that comes up, it literally delineates what a CSP is. You have an application platform and you're providing messaging to multiple businesses. You are a CSP, you are not a reseller, and you need to be registering directly with the campaign registry. There's a one-time $200 fee to do that. Something to do with us. One-time fee, you get access there. And then when you create that allows you, when you create brands, the brands belong to you, not your messaging provider. The vettings belong to you, not your messaging provider. And when you create campaigns under that brand, you get to elect your connectivity partner for that campaign. So you can elect Telgorithm for one, you could elect some other provider for another, and that keeps you vendor agnostic, but it's also the proper way for you to register if you are truly an ISV or CSP, not as a reseller. And while it's true that many of them say, oh, campaigns are non-transferable, that's today. That's being looked at by the registry. But what is transferable or remains with you is when you register as a CSP is your brand and the vettings. And that is something that they're, for whatever reason, they're leaving that information out. You can validate this yourself on campaignregistry.com, and it's fundamental to your success. First of all, even if you wanted a multi-thread, no vendor is perfect. You want to use multiple vendors. You cannot do that if you're registering as a reseller, or you can, but you'd have to register your same brand 3 different times and all their vettings double the money, and it's a whole craziness to manage and maintain all of that. So the answer is to your question is, I don't know how your setup is today, but if you have a pending campaign, so first of all, you could delete it, and you should be, if you're a reseller, I'm assuming their portal allows you to delete it at any time, but you could always go with Telgorithm specifically, we only support CSPs. So a prerequisite to using Telgorithm is you must be a campaign service provider. And that means you go directly to the registry, you register there, and we can assist you because we have a close relationship with them with speeding up that approval process. And then you create that brand there, a new brand there, even though it's the same company, you can create that brand under your CSP account. In the campaign, you would elect Telgorithm, and you could do that right away. That is regardless, even if you leave that pending campaign, you could do that completely in parallel without even touching that. So you could leave that in pending with your provider, go to CSP account, create a brand, create a campaign, share it with us or with any provider, and that process will be completely done in parallel.
Awesome. Cool, Aaron. Well, as always, these conversations fly by. I feel like we just started.
You do. Never
We're
enough
only,
time.
I know, never enough time. We only have about 4 minutes left. So I'm going to open the floor back up to you. Thank you to everyone who asked your questions. We hope that we answered them as thoroughly as possible. But what would you like to leave our guests with?
For sure. So again, this has been a process, and it's unfortunate that in this industry, many times, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Providers many times have different motives, and those motives aren't always having the customer's best intentions in mind. Many of these providers have built brand names, and so people hear a brand name, they hear an Amazon, they hear a Google type name, just mention those names, as an example, and then all of a sudden, because it's Google, they must have it right, I must trust them. People many times become very trusting, and that's a good trait to have, but you should be careful, particularly in this industry where unfortunately, it's not always what it seems. And at minimum, you should always be researching, well, what is the competitor doing? Or can I go to the source? Where is the source of all this coming from? So I could validate, at least if my provider is saying the right thing, so I could hold them accountable at minimum. And what we've done here at Telgorithm, it's something that's very passionate to us. And what our mission, our vision, and our product is being the customer. We were the customer, myself and my co-founders, of the cloud communication providers for many, many years at Service Titan and other providers. And we got the short end of the stick, and we had to go down all these rabbit holes to figure this mess out. And we're passionate about this, and we created a product and service so that others don't have to do that, and created a product in a way where we allow customers to understand that they're not trusting because they've been burnt, and give them a path where we can build that trust with them without them having to give, an arm and a leg, as we say, to validate if things are right. But more importantly, it's about information. It's understanding what is happening fundamentally, root cause, and root core of that problem to be able to come up with a solution. And you should validate any vendor in that way. But in Telgorithm, it's tech, our service. This is what we're about. So the one thing I'll say about Telgorithm is we're not hundreds of things. We don't do send grids and all this emailing and all this other stuff. We do one thing, and we do one thing very well, and that is text messaging, and particularly A2P 10DLC messaging. We have cutting edge tech that supports that. We believe is mission critical for it. And we provide an optimal customer service that's constantly listening to our customers in real time. We give our customers dedicated Slack channels, which we have directly with the aggregators as well. And we've worked very, very hard to build relationships with all the players in the ecosystem to provide an optimal experience for every single one of our customers. And at minimum, what I'll say is give us a chance, talk to us, talk to our team, see what we're about, and give us the opportunity to, just as like with anyone else, to prove ourselves to you in that area. And you might be decently surprised.
Perfect. Well said. Thank you guys so much, especially to those who have stayed with us the entire hour. We really appreciate it. Please reach out to us
Definitely.
on our website, telgorithm.com, any of our social handles at Telgorithm, team@telgorithm.com, email address. We're here to talk to you. We're here to help you. We know these are crazy times, but this is what we're passionate about. Our entire team is on board. We are great at customer service. We will hold your hand every step of the way. So we got your back.
Try us out.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.